Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
Do it.
All right, Wildsiders. I hope that you have a seatbelt handy because you're going to have to buckle up for this one.
Yeah, and this is going to be, I think every episode deserves a trigger warning. But this one deserves a trigger warning. It is wholly 100% about domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to cover this case, and then I actually have a colleague of mine who is kind of, what would you call it, expert in domestic violence. That's been pretty much her entire career. And so we are going to get to interview her. Fingers crossed we can get it done and drop it Friday. Worst case scenario, maybe next Monday. But you guys really need to thank Chelsea for this episode because I am in a nervous system freeze right now and I'm completely useless. I'm just a big pile of heaping bones and flesh. Like there's nothing getting it going.
I mean, welcome to the club. I read this case to Lucas, or to my husband, and he, it's so interesting to get another person's perspective on cases, and he just literally was shaking his head the entire time. Like he
was angry, disgusted.
Yeah, like he just could not really believe it. And at one point he was like, okay, but this was in like modern culture. This was not in the 1600s. He said, What? I don't understand. Like this feels like it should have happened way longer ago. Right. He was like, I felt like we had made more progress in our nation. And I just thought that was so interesting that was the big thing that he picked up on, where he was just like, I can't believe that this case happened.
Like mid 80s, right?
Right. So it's mid 80s. And so I get it, right? It's 40 plus years ago, but still, like, you think of this stuff as like, oh, this should have happened in the 40s or the 30s or even the 50s. It just, so I'll be interested to hear you guys' reaction to some of the information or all of the information regarding this case.
Yeah. And as just kind of a side note, we did get some feedback from a listener. And definitely, I think all feedback is important feedback. And she was like, I love you guys' podcast so much, but the background music is so distracting. Like, I can't. So what we're going to experiment with is just turning it way on down. Because I think it's one of those things that it's going to be a personal preference, because for me, if things are too quiet, I get really annoyed and distracted, and it's too much for me almost. So, but we're gonna try it out, and we would love to kind of hear you guys' thoughts on this episode if it's a little bit easier on your earballs.
I think earballs is a technical term. Good job, Bailey.
I told y'all I'm so useless, so bad. Okay, so we're just gonna get into it because it's heavy. But this is also going to be a little bit more of a technical case because this is a legal, what's the word? Cornerstone case? Is that the right word?
Yeah, it was a pivotal case as far as really changing the tides. And as in the world of biology, you would call it a keystone species, meaning like this case really kind of controlled what happened in the environment.
All right.
Afterwards.
All right. So without further ado, let's kick it off. So some true crime cases begin with eerie questions, and others begin with violence. Tonight's case begins with something definitely very unsettling, but more subtle, and that is paperwork. Police reports, court filings, restraining orders, warnings written down again and again, long before blood was ever spilled. Because the terrifying truth about the case of Tracey Thurman is not that nobody knew she was in danger. It's that quite literally everybody knew that she was in danger, and pretty much nothing changed. Domestic violence rarely arrives without warning. Psychologically, abuse follows patterns: escalation, control, intimidation, reconciliation, and then escalation again. Victims often recognize danger long before anybody else does. And Tracey Thurman did everything society told her to do, that society at the time told the victims to do. She reported it, she left, she sought court protection, and she called the police repeatedly. And still, on June 10th of 1983, she was very nearly killed outside her home. Tonight's case asks a deeply uncomfortable question: what happens when a victim does everything right, and once again, per all of our episodes, the system still fails?
And guys, this story, it's not just about the violence. It's not about the gore. It really, in a weird way, is about accountability. Before Tracey Thurman, domestic violence was widely treated as a private family dispute. Police departments often mediated rather than enforced the law. But Tracey's case forced courts to confront whether victims of domestic violence were being denied the same protection given to everyone else. And the answer would change American policing forever. Now, like all of our stories, Tracey Thurman was just your hometown girl. She grew up in Torrington, Connecticut, which in the 1970s was a working class industrial town built around mills and manufacturing. It wasn't flashy or fast paced, but it was stable. Her life, unfortunately, changed significantly when she was 18 and her mother passed away of lung cancer. Losing a parent at any age can disrupt more than just family structure. It often affects education, financial stability, and long-term planning. Tracey had few close ties remaining in Torrington after her mother's death, and she made a decision to leave. So in 1979, at the age of 18, she was almost finished with her high school career and decided to drop out of high school and move to St. Petersburg, Florida. This kind of move suggests both independence and vulnerability. If you ask us, Bailey and I had kind of talked about this. And, you have to think, she was young, she was grieving, and I think she just really wanted to start over. But unfortunately, starting over without a diploma or a support system, it can be tricky, right? And in Florida, she found work as a hotel maid, and it was physically demanding and not particularly secure, but it did provide income and a sense of direction at the time when she really just needed both. And when someone experiences significant loss, especially at a young age, it can change how they evaluate relationships. And you also have to think, Bailey and I are always talking about, in your prefrontal lobe is not quite developed, right? All these things come into play. Grief often increases the need for connection and stability. People in that position may be more likely to commit quickly to someone who offers assurance or attention. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. That does not mean that Tracey was careless or incapable of judgment or anybody who's in a similar situation. It just means that they're human and that they're having to adjust to the instability and they're seeking out relationship. It was during this period in Florida that Tracey met Charles Buck Thurman. The timing does matter. She was building a new life, quite literally from scratch, without close family nearby, and navigating adulthood without the guidance that she had grown up with. That was all taken away quickly. Those circumstances do not determine what happens next, but they help explain why certain dynamics may have felt reassuring, or at least at first.
Yeah, and just kind of as a side note, because y'all know I have to kind of nerd out, but one of my favorite kind of theories to refer back to is Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. And Tracey was at that. She was on a cusp. She was 18. And so between, like, when you're in your teens, that's identity versus confusion. Like, it's not a phase, mom, right? That's where you were really trying to hone in on your identity and your sense of self. And then whenever you get to like the next step or the next stage, that is intimacy versus isolation between the ages of 18 and 40. So that's a big chunk. And this is where we are primarily focused socially, psychologically, on developing committed, intimate relationships, right? So again, it just reinforces the fact that there's nothing wrong with wanting to find a partner. It's quite literally the next step in our development. So kind of getting back into the case, Tracey is in St. Petersburg, Florida. And also at the same time, there was a man by the name of Buck Thurman, and he was 17. And that is when he and Tracey met. He had come down from Virginia and was working construction there in Florida. And of course, Buck was really described as kind of one of those outgoing, personable, and gregarious type of people. Super comfortable in social settings, could make a really good first impression. And so, traits like this are not inherently negative, but it can make it easier for someone to move in a relationship more quickly with people like this. Tracey and Buck began living together within 2 weeks of meeting. And arguably that pace is significant in some way. When you kind of rush into a relationship, it limits the time that you really get to evaluate this person through and through. This is where you might overlook compatibility or even some warning signs or some red flags because you haven't spent a whole lot of time in different scenarios. When relationships accelerate quickly, emotional attachment can kind of form before trust and stability is fully established, okay? To kind of top it off, Buck's construction work required travel. And so Tracey began kind of going with him while he would go state to state for his work. And this may look like a super cute thing and a couple is building their life together. But if we look at it kind of in hindsight, it's kind of a perfect opportunity to isolate somebody from their friends or their family, right? Because you're always on the road. It can kind of create some power dynamics in a relationship. Eventually, Tracey and Buck got married and returned to Torrington, where Buck found steady employment as a counterman and short order cook at Sky's Diner. Stability in work did not translate to stability at home, however. The marriage between the two really started to deteriorate pretty quickly. And it's that same old song and dance where Buck's behavior began starting to be controlling and then physically abusive. And unfortunately, even during Tracey's pregnancy with their first son, CJ. Now, Tracey did what she was supposed to do, right? According to all of us, civilians, normies, people listening in. She left multiple times. And this pattern is consistent with what researchers ultimately call the cycle of abuse. After incidents of violence, the abusive partner often shifts into this really sweet, sappy, almost honeymoon phase again, apologizing, promising change, and temporarily changing their behavior. And just like anything, it can create hope that the violence will stop. When that hope is combined with financial dependence, emotional attachment, and now a child, leaving permanently becomes super difficult. Understanding the pattern is important, and we'll get into that more with the expert, but it does help explain behavior without excusing the harm. It also shows how abuse is rarely a single explosive event. It's almost always a repeated cycle that grows more dangerous each time it goes through the loop.
You know, I really have to applaud Tracey. And like Bailey kept saying, she really was doing what everybody, when we hear about these situations, you know, it's always like, oh, she needs to leave. You need to put your foot down. She was doing all those things, right? By the fall of 1982, Tracey had made it clear that she was done. She was completely finished, and that phase of her life, that chapter, was having to be closed. She had left Buck and was staying with friends Judy Bentley and Richard St. Hilaire, and they're in Torrington. What followed was not one, again, explosive incident, but a steady escalation over 8 months. And these things were documented, they were reported, and they were repeatedly minimized. On November 1st, 1982, Buck forced his way into the residence where Tracey and her infant son, Charles J. Thurman Jr., or as he's known as CJ, were staying. Once inside, he allegedly grabbed the baby and fled. According to the formal complaint, he told Tracey, quote, "If we can't bring up the baby together, no one will." He also warned her that if she contacted the police, he would kill her. But Tracey called anyway. Police retrieved CJ and returned him safely. But when it came to filing criminal trespass charges for the forced entry, officers declined to pursue them. From their perspective, the matter appeared resolved once CJ was returned. 2 days later, on November 3rd, Tracey reported threatening phone calls. Then, on November 9th, 1982, the situation escalated publicly. Confronted her in the parking lot outside the municipal building, directly above the police station. Now, there was an officer that was standing nearby as Buck was screaming threats at her. Intervention occurred only after Buck smashed her windshield with his fist while she was still inside the vehicle. Now, Buck was arrested, convicted of breach of peace the next day, and on November 10th, 1982, was given a 6-month suspended sentence and a 2-year conditional discharge. The order required him to stay away from Tracey and commit no further crimes. On paper, it looked like accountability. I think we can agree with this. In practice, it changed very little. Within weeks, Buck resumed violating the court order. On December 31st, 1982, he appeared at the residence again and threatened her. Tracey again called the police. No arrest followed. From January 1983 through early May 1983, Tracey and her friends contacted the Torrington Police Department repeatedly, reporting threats, probation violation, and escalating hostility. According to later federal court records, officers either failed to take formal complaints or advised her to, quote, wait for the appropriate personnel. At one point, Bailey, I don't think Bailey's heard this part yet. At one point, she was told to return in 3 weeks to pursue an arrest warrant. And another time, she was informed that the only officer who could assist her was on vacation. So she'd have to maybe come back. Bailey.
Don't like that.
This is so wild to me. This is where my husband was just shaking his head. He's just like, are you kidding me?
Also, like, to be fair, this, and it's not excusing it, but it's truly just painting a picture of what it was like at the time, right?
Yeah.
Like, Oh, sorry. You're going to have to come back in a couple weeks because the lady who does this is on vacation. And
Yeah.
it just really goes to show that I don't think people really understood domestic violence in general, A, and B, understood how dangerous it is and was at the time.
Well, true. And we're about to add another little bit of a layer to this. So, meanwhile, Buck continued working locally at Sky's Diner, while members of the Torrington Police Department were regular patrons, right? So he probably knew a lot of these guys. He was probably friends. They were probably buddies, you know? Court documents later noted that he openly told officers that he intended to, quote, get his wife and kill her even. But again, right? At what point are you just like, oh, I'm so mad at my husband, I could just kill him, right? And they're like, yeah, had a hard day
Right.
with it. I don't know.
I mean, I think it was the same mentality, the good old boy system, even with like the KKK, right? Like their buddies were like, you know, I'm into this and I don't like this and I'm going to kill this person. And they're just like, oh, Bobby, you know, have a piece of pie, sit down, without really even thinking twice about the severity of it. You know what I mean?
Right. Now, on May 6, 1983, Tracey took independent legal action and obtained an ex parte restraining order from the Lynchfield Superior Court. The order explicitly prohibited Buck from assaulting, threatening, or harassing her, and the police department was absolutely notified. But a restraining order is only as effective as its enforcement. Between January and May, the pattern remained consistent. Repeated reports, minimal response. By early June 1983, the documentation existed. Yes, the complaints existed. The court order existed. But the protection, that did not.
You know, and without beating a dead horse, I just really want to talk about what this woman kept doing to protect herself. She obviously was aware of the danger that she and her son were in, and she was doing what she had to do and should have done and was doing it correctly for herself. She documented the stuff. She documented the threats. She filed the complaints. She sought the criminal charges. She pursued restraining orders. She physically went to the police station multiple times. She involved family and friends. She requested escorts. She initiated divorce proceedings. This woman was almost the only person fighting for her life and her safety. And obviously, right, this is showing that someone is not minimizing their situation. It's quite the opposite. She knew that this was escalating because his behavior was. You know, this reminds me of the super infamous Dixie Chick songs where they're like, Earl walked straight through that restraining order and put her in intensive care. Like, this whole case kind of reminds me of that. So just to kind of try to wrap your head around it, between January and May of 1983, Tracey repeatedly reported probation violations and explicit threats. Officers were informed again and again and again that Buck had threatened to shoot her, kill her, and or harm their son. And nothing was done. You know, hopefully we're going to dive into this with the interview later, but this research consistently shows that at the point when the victim tries to leave is the most dangerous phase of the cycle. When control is threatened, this is when the violence usually escalates. And in Tracey's case, once she refused reconciliation and initiated the divorce, this is when the behavior from Buck escalated. But she kept trying. She returned after being told to wait. She came back when told the officer was unavailable. She continued. The tragedy that would happen on June 10th, 1983, obviously did not occur in isolation. It occurred after months of warnings, reports, formal court orders. And so here we are. On Friday, June 10th, 1983, in Torrington, Connecticut, Charles Buck Thurman appeared once again at the residence of Judy Bentley and Richard St. Hilaire, where Tracey Thurman and her nearly 3-year-old son, CJ, were staying. There was no legal gray area that afternoon. Buck was under a 2-year conditional discharge imposed after his November 10th conviction for the breach of peace. He had been ordered to stay away from Tracey, and obviously he does not. When Tracey saw Buck outside the home that afternoon, again, she did what she had been doing for months. She called the Torrington Police Department and requested that he be arrested for violating probation. And approximately 20 minutes passed. Officer Frederick Petrovitz arrived and parked across the street, remaining inside his patrol car. This detail is not speculation or a rumor. It literally appears in the federal court records. The pattern had defined the previous 8 months: delay, observe, and there was minimal intervention. It was repeating itself in real time. At some point during this 20-minute wait, Tracey decides to step outside. She began to try to reason with Buck and in her mind prevent further escalation, likely keeping him from taking CJ again. But Buck did not argue. Instead, he pulled a knife. He began to chase Tracey into the yard, where he caught up with her and threw her to the ground. In full view of neighbors, Buck stabbed Tracey repeatedly in the chest, neck, throat, and face. There were multiple stab wounds and catastrophic blood loss. Officer Petrovitz approached the stabbing after it had begun, and he took the knife from Buck, but did not immediately arrest him. While Tracey lay bleeding, Buck kicked her in the head. He then ran into the house. Mind you, there is a whole ass officer standing outside. Buck ran into the house, grabbed their son CJ, returned outside, and shouted, "I killed your fucking mother." He dropped the toddler directly onto Tracey's blood-soaked body, and he kicked her again. By this point, additional officers, Officer D'Angelo, Newkirk, and Columbia, arrived on scene. Buck continued moving freely. As Tracey was being placed on a stretcher for transport, Buck literally attempted to approach her again, which is when officers finally restrained him and took him into custody. Can you wrap your head around the fact that there were now 4 officers standing around the front yard, not really intervening with Buck? She is on a stretcher and he tries to attack her again, and that is the only time that this man is restrained. Obviously, this assault did not unfold in mere seconds or minutes. It wasn't an ambush from jumping out behind the bushes. This was an assault that occurred over a prolonged span. Approximately 25 minutes after the initial call before police arrived, and close to 50 minutes before medical assistance fully intervened. Neighbors witnessed it. Officers were present, yet intervention was delayed. I mean, it's just insanity to me.
Now, Tracey survived, miraculously. But when Tracey arrived at the hospital later that day on June 10th, she was in critical condition. She had been stabbed 13 times in the chest, neck, throat, and face. One of the wounds punctured her esophagus. She had also been kicked repeatedly in the head. The first priority was survival. Surgeons worked to control internal bleeding and repair the damage to her throat and chest. Injuries to the esophagus are especially serious because they affect swallowing and breathing and carry a really high risk for infection. For days, her condition would have required close monitoring, breathing support, wound management, and constant assessment for complications. She remained in the hospital for approximately 7 months. That length of stay alone tells you how extensive these injuries were. Recovery was not simply about healing cuts. The kicks to her head caused permanent nerve damage, leaving her partially paralyzed on her left side. Like, guys, I'm so sorry. Like, it makes me sick to my stomach to think about how forceful these kicks were to cause permanent, like, nerve damage, right? Permanent paralysis. When she began to regain consciousness and awareness, she had to process 2 realities at once. She had survived, 1, and 2, her body was no longer and would never be the same. She experienced limited sensation from her elbow down to her fingertips and also from her knee down to her toes on the left side. Her right leg retained more feeling, but was physically weaker, which made balance really uncertain. After being discharged, she spent roughly 8 months in a wheelchair. Physical therapy became part of a daily life. Walking again required relearning balance and building strength in muscles that had been damaged or weakened while she was there in the hospital. Even after regaining mobility, she walked with a noticeable limp and lived with permanent nerve damage. The visible injuries were significant as well. A deep scar extended across her face from ear to ear, and that scar would remain long after the hospital stay ended. We'll post some pictures. I mean, guys, it's horrific. The scars that this woman has are horrific. Her daily routines absolutely changed. Tasks that had once been automatic, picking up her son, drying her hair, clipping her nails, changing clothes or laundry, became physically demanding or impossible without assistance. Recovery meant adapting to those changes, not just medically, but practically. Her entire road to recovery was just absolutely unbelievable, and she would never fully return to what she had been before the June 10th attack.
Now, after months of painful recovery in February of 1984, Tracey really proved what a hashtag boss babe she really is. Okay. She ended up filing a federal civil rights lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the District of Connecticut. She sued under what's known as Section 1983. That's 42 U.S. Code Section 1983, which is a federal law that lets people hold government officials accountable when they violate constitutional rights. And this was her argument, which was pretty bold for its time. So basically, she's saying from October of 1982 through June of 1983, the Torrington Police Department repeatedly failed to protect her because the man threatening her was her husband. She argued that if this were a stranger that had attacked her, she believes that police would have acted more intentional or would have acted at all. By treating domestic violence differently from other assaults, again, was her argument, she's saying that the city violated her 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law, which is actually quite brilliant. She didn't just name one officer. She sued the entire city itself and 29 officers. Again, pointing out that this wasn't just about one assault. It was about 8 months of essentially neglect and failure on the police department's fault. Now, the city typically, it responded in the way that cities and governments often do in civil rights cases. They tried to shut it down early. They filed a motion to dismiss, and they said it was because even if what Tracey claimed to be true, it didn't amount to a constitutional violation. They leaned on a narrow interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause, arguing that it was designed to address racial discrimination, not what they framed as a private marital dispute. Now, this is the thing. If the judge accepted that argument, then the case would end before a jury ever heard her story. But by 1984, constitutional law had moved beyond that narrow view, thank goodness, and courts had already ruled that equal protection applies to gender discrimination and other unequal treatment, not just race. So now Tracey wasn't claiming the law itself was written to discriminate. She was arguing that the police enforced the law differently when the victim was the wife, as it was in her case. And she said it showed up in practice. And here we are, you guys, drum roll. On October 23rd, 1984, Judge M. Joseph Blumenfield denied the city's motion to dismiss. His ruling made something super clear. Equal protection doesn't just prohibit unfair laws, it also prohibits unfair enforcement. If police protect assault victims generally, but provide, quote, lesser protection when the attacker is a spouse, then it very well can violate the Constitution. Marriage does not reduce someone's right to safety. And now, you guys, this decision was pivotal, absolutely pivotal. It shifted the focus from what the law says on paper to how it operates in real life. By allowing the case to move forward, the court opened the door to holding institutions accountable for patterns of indifference, not just obvious discrimination. And arguably, that's why the city fought so hard to stop it. But even as the court recognized the broader pattern affecting Tracey, it drew a sharp line when it came to another victim standing just feet away from her that day, which was her son.
Tracey did not sue only for herself. She also filed a claim on behalf of her son, Charles J. Thurman Jr., aka CJ. And guys, we have to remember that this baby witnessed the attack that had almost killed his mother. And he was 3, right? Bailey and I, obviously, we grew up in the South, so everybody's baby. But he was 3 years old. After Officer Frederick Petrovitz took the knife from Buck, he did not immediately arrest him. CJ was present as his father kicked his mom again and again and again while she lay bleeding. The trauma did not end that day. When Tracey was reunited with her son after 7 months in the hospital, CJ reportedly did not recognize her because of her scars and paralysis. And he, rightly so, reacted with fear and confusion. He developed an intense fear of ambulance sirens and remained anxious about his mother's safety for years after this. When Tracey filed her federal civil rights lawsuit in February of 1984, she included claims on CJ's behalf, again arguing that the city of Torrington had also failed to protect him. But on November 23rd, 1984, the court dismissed CJ's claim. So they gave Tracey's claim the go-ahead, right? But they did dismiss CJ's claim. The judge ruled that although what happened to him was undeniably tragic, it qualified as a, quote, isolated failure, rather than proof of a broader policy or pattern of discrimination against him. Unlike Tracey, who had 8 months of documented ignored complaints against this system, right, against the law enforcement, CJ did not have the prior record tied specifically to him. Because of that distinction, the court concluded that his experience, however devastating, did not meet the constitutional threshold required to hold the municipality liable. And with that ruling, Tracey's claim had to move forward alone. Now, the case then proceeded to trial in June of 1985. And this is where the cultural shift became concrete. The jury heard the entire chronology. And look, guys, I know that we've said it, but I think it's important to hear this one more time, to listen to this timeline of neglect and the rapid escalation. So starting in October 1982, that was the first physical assault. November 1st through the 5th of 1982, formal complaints are filed after Buck takes CJ and smashes Tracey's window in her car, right? November 10th, Buck is convicted of breach of peace and placed on conditional discharge. December 31st, the police is notified of violation of probation and no arrest is made. January 1st through May 4th, 1983, the court specifically notes, quote, numerous telephone complaints reporting threats and requesting arrest. May 4th through the 5th, written complaint seeking arrest warrant. May 6th, restraining order issued, police notified. May 25th through the 31st, additional complaints and warrants requested. June 5th, another report of Buck appearing outside her window. And then finally, June 10th was the final call for help before the stabbing. Guys, that is 8 months of formal complaints and police contacts. 8 months.
And I think it's safe to say that this was really powerful when it was all laid out. And so on June 25th, 1985, after just hours of deliberation, the jury found 24 of the 29 officers negligent in failing to protect Tracey Thurman. Nearly half of the department was held accountable. The jury then awarded her $2.3 million in compensatory damages. Again, in 1985, that amount was a lot. It was a lot. It was a whole lot. It was not symbolic. It was a public rebuke. It signaled that the cost of indifference had legal consequences, as it should. To avoid prolonged appeals and the possibility of liens being placed on officers' homes to satisfy the money judgment, the parties later settled for $1.9 million. But by then, the legal precedent had already been established. For the first time, you guys, 1985, for the first time in American history, a court affirmed that failure to protect a domestic violence victim could constitute a violation of constitutional rights. Domestic violence was no longer treated as merely a private family matter. It now had become a civil rights issue. Now, meanwhile, the criminal case against Charles Buck Thurman unfolded on a separate track. He had been arrested on June 10th of 83 after the attack on Tracey, and on August 12th of 1987, he was convicted of first-degree assault and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Yet even that sentence, no surprise, did not bring lasting closure. Just a few years later, in 1991, after only serving 8 years, he was released on parole. Reports indicate that he continued making threats even while he was incarcerated, right? This is like the Hopkinson dude. The legal system had finally acknowledged Tracey's rights, but the danger she lived with did not disappear overnight.
Okay, so the broader impact of this case is truly undeniable. So following the June 25th, 1985 verdict, insurance companies began pressuring municipalities to implement formal domestic violence response policies. In 1986, Connecticut enacted the Family Violence Prevention and Response Act, often referred to as the Tracey Thurman Law, which required mandatory arrest when probable cause exists in domestic violent cases. By 1989, roughly 84% of police departments nationwide had adopted stronger arrest policies. Then, in 1994, Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act, providing federal resources and strengthening enforcement mechanisms nationwide. Now, this case, Thurman versus City of Torrington, it didn't eliminate domestic violence, obviously. But what it did do was alter how institutions were expected to respond. It reframed domestic abuse from a private dispute to a matter of constitutional accountability. And that shift continues to shape our world today.
Tracey Thurman's case was the first time a federal court recognized that the government cannot provide lesser protection to victims of domestic abuse than to victims of other assaults. Before Tracey, the law tended to kind of close the blinds on what happened in the home. And because of Tracey Thurman, the curtain was torn down. She quite literally shifted the national baseline of what we as a society are willing to tolerate. And I think she deserves that. She is a hashtag bad mama jamma. And that is the case of Tracey Thurman.
Yeah, she absolutely is. You know, it's really interesting, Bailey. So shortly after this case in 1989, there was a television film called A Cry for Help, the Tracey Thurman story. And it aired during the very first National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which really, I mean, you have to think about how impactful this one case was worldwide.
Yeah.
Or I guess I shouldn't say worldwide.
Nationwide, yeah.
But nationwide, you know, like I think it really spoke. And that's what's that's what's so sad to me about this is I think it really spoke to societies and to people and communities and to couples and women, especially across our nation, right? For them to really be like, finally something is happening. And it really created a domino effect that needed to happen in our nation.
Yeah. And I think we still really struggle with it as a society. I think we are a little bit better as far as understanding and being a little bit more educated on domestic violence in general. But it still happens. Obviously, domestic violence still happens, but it also still is one of those things, like, I think in society, people are very quick to be like, don't interfere, right? Don't interfere with somebody else's marriage. Don't, like, you know what I mean? Like, that's still a pretty prominent response, I think, for most people.
Sure.
You know, and I think it's sometimes just human nature for people just to be like, I'm not going to get in the middle of that because I don't know what that's about, and it's scary and it's uncomfortable, and I'm just going to kind of pretend it didn't happen and go on about my day.
Right. Well, I mean, Bailey, too, it's a heavy burden. So Bailey and I both have worked in fields for many, many years where we are mandatory reporters, right? And we've talked about instances, you know, we talked about one not too long ago, and it's not an easy, like, oh, okay, let me get involved in this quickly and fill out some paperwork and kind of be done. It's a huge commitment to get involved in the messiness of things like abuse, domestic violence. You know, like, it's a huge commitment. And that is something that is, I mean, especially in our world, we're kind of robbed for time. We're really low on time and energy and resources a lot of times. And that's a hard thing to want to add to your plate.
Well, I also, like, I totally understand what you're saying because I speak your language, but I also don't want people to hear when you say it's a burden. that
Well, I'm
their
just
burden.
saying that is how people a lot of times look at it, is like, I don't want to open this can of worms, right? Like, what would that look like? If I walked into this, what if I was wrong? What if there's nothing going on?
Sure.
Then what's the fallout going to be from that? What if it ruins, a relationship because I was wrong? I just feel like there's a lot in that. I just think it's a cumbersome situation.
Yeah, it's emotionally taxing kind of all around
Mhm.
because it's just it sucks, right? Like
Mhm.
there's not really sometimes, I would be in sessions and clients would say, share something that just was awful. And I'd be like, you want to know what the clinical word for that is? And I'm not being sarcastic. It was like just my kind of personality style. Um, and they'd be like, what? I'd be like, it fucking sucks. Like there
Yeah,
is no clinical word that replaces the fact that it just sucks, But
absolutely.
I do think that a lot of people have an understanding of domestic violence, but they don't really understand it, right?
Mhm.
Plus they're, like super duper trained in it or they've been through it. So that's why I know it's not Domestic Violence Awareness Month. That's later in the year. And we'll probably do something DV related again because,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
you can never do it enough. But I did want to choose a case where you guys walked away with a little bit of hope that victims are not victims, right? That they can quite literally change the foundation of legislation and policy when it comes to this stuff.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, and as Bailey and I are always saying, we always hope that our podcasts are educational, and we hope that that brings some awareness to you and your life. And we're just super thankful that we have the ability to bring some awareness to cases like this.
So, and as always, you guys, thanks for hanging out with us through this wild and crazy ride.
And we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.